The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Professor Dolores Cahil, the Irish immunologist, molecular biologist, and medical researcher. You are an expert on pathogenic viruses and vaccines, with your academic work being cited over 5,900 times. You've been a member of the Advisory Science Council to the Irish government and a member of the International Science Advisory Board. You pioneered research at the Max Planck Institute of Molecular Genetics in Berlin and hold several international patents in biomarker diversity, diagnostics, and personalized medicine. Throughout the global coronavirus pandemic, you've been campaigning to end lockdowns and the unnecessary erosion of our freedoms. Instead, you advocate the use of proven science to overcome this crisis. Professor Cahill, welcome to London Real.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure.
It's great having you here. Before we get started, I just want to announce to everyone that we are streaming now on our brand new Digital Freedom platform, a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everyone watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels? Let me repeat that. Can everyone watching us please share this link now via the sidebar to all your social media channels? This is important. Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and they can decide. Professor Cahill, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anyone in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at londonreal.tv/Cahill. Thanks to the generous donations of over 31,000 people around the world, we affectionately call the London Real Army, of which you are one, Professor. For anyone wanting...
My first day, I am one. Yeah.
I love it. For anyone else who wants to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can visit freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And Professor Cahill, I'm excited to have you here today. I don't know where to start, but I probably do, because I think we share the fact that we've been censored. Both of us have had some of our ideas censored on some of these big technology platforms. And I kind of want to jump in and talk about that because honestly, Dolores, up until April 6th, nothing I had ever said was ever censored. You know, no one in the news had ever said things about me. No one had whispered behind my back, you know, but now once I was censored, I feel like I've kind of gone into this other world. And now I'm surrounded by people that it's kind of normal to have their work talked about in a strange way. And it's been fascinating for me to observe, and also not very fun to know that when I speak something out of my mouth, other people can say it's dangerous for other people to hear it. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts. Again, thank you so much for being a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform. It means so much. You know, we can speak freely here, and it's hard to emphasize how important that is, because if
I suppose I totally agree. And I suppose if people wouldn't be aware that there is an issue in science around differences of opinions in a number of areas. So people might be aware of it maybe in the UK about, say, if you want to say there's a biological difference between men and women, or if you want to challenge the debate around carbon dioxide and climate change that has been going on for about 15 years. So because I've come across these issues in my work in the universities and on the government advisory science councils, that's what encouraged me to speak up now when it comes to coronavirus, because essentially what we are being told is not how the immune system works. And they are trying to push a narrative that is not based on the decades of immunology. And when you see it in the light of around free speech or building false consensuses in science, then you can see how the media and who is interviewed on, we'll say, the BBC, or big stations are actually not reflective of the science. And if we don't speak up, they are going to impose a new narrative which is not true. So I also set up a party called Irish Freedom. I've been involved in setting it up, and I've been advocating free speech and open debate for all issues in society. So that's what encouraged me to speak up now.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the work you've done for that. I know you've run for office as well without any media support. And, you know, I never realized how much I valued freedom of speech until this happened. But my gut reaction, my knee-jerk reaction in my DNA, Dolores, was, no, this is not okay. And that's what we've been on this fight for the past 2 months to create our own platform so we can have these conversations. Because, you know, I grew up in California and in America in the 70s as a kid. You could say whatever you want. You could talk about the president. You can do anything. And so the fact we can't speak about science makes me even more kind of enraged. And I have a science background as well. But let me get this right, Dolores. Since you've been in the science community, you know there's a tendency in science and research and academia to kind of push unpopular ideas kind of away or down below the surface. And so when this came out with coronavirus, you had been used to this kind of behavior and you said, not this time, I need to talk about it. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So I suppose I invented or co-invented with my team high content protein arrays back in 1996-97. And one of the first applications of that was to look at antibodies that were used in research. And antibodies are used in diagnostic tests to diagnose disease and sometimes quite serious diseases like autoimmune diseases and cancer. So when we applied our technology, we were screening thousands more proteins. We were getting very good results. But when we were telling the scientific collaborators that no, what you've published is incorrect, there was a lot of reluctance within the scientific community to actually correct the record, which they could have easily done because this was a new technology. So that brought me in for 20 years around research integrity and how a lot of the publications in science may not be true. And that I have been on volunteering and unpaid on the Government Advisory Science Council and in the EU to try and move towards validation of science results, and that careers should be promoted based on people putting their results and data and antibodies into open repositories so that other people can check the data. And this would enrich science. And because there's been a lot of reluctance from the funding agencies and the governments, a lot of the scientific papers are based on tools and research that are not true. And actually, I've been considering getting out of science. And that's, I think, why a lot of the clinical trials are failing, because a lot of the tools and a lot of the publications are not validated and may be incorrect. So I was able to then look at what was going on in the coronavirus, and the whole narrative is false. And maybe just for the few people who might stay for the first 15 minutes, I would like to say to them, it is very confusing. They are getting conflicting messages from eminent scientists. But from my perspective, I'm saying we don't need the lockdown. We don't need masks. We don't need social distancing. Eat well, boost your immune system. There are preventative measures, and talk to your doctors to get early and effective treatments like hydroxychloroquine and zinc. And we can re-engage in the world within a week. There is no need for the lockdown. No need for any of these new societal changes. Businesses, tourist industry, schools can open and we can go back to work.
And so the question people will ask right away is, then how did we get here? How did we get into this mess with, you know, apparently intelligent people at the helm? You know, how did we get to this crazy lockdown environment, to these figures around the world of 6 million cases and hundreds of thousands of deaths, apparently because of COVID-19? How did it happen?
So I suppose that's why the carbon dioxide climate change debate is actually very interesting, because what happens is now that you have scientific areas emerging which are not challenged and based on false premises. And then funding agencies, you know, start a funding application with, for example, carbon dioxide is the biggest driver of climate change, which it isn't. And so if a lot of the money is funded into an area, and if you don't agree with that premise and write a grant with that premise, you won't get funding, and then you won't get publications, and you won't get a promotion. So what's going on now and why we're here is a lot of the governments worldwide do not have scientific advisors that are actually where they challenge each other. So what I'm saying as a lesson from the lockdown is we need to have open debates with, representation on public forum like the BBC or Channel 4, where before you would have a lockdown, you would give, equal time to various scientists with different opinions, and then that the governments would be informed for the pros and cons of the lockdown and why some of the data that the lockdown is built on, it came out very quickly that it was incorrect. And so what questions need to be asked is, why didn't they stop the lockdown weeks ago?
Now, you had coronavirus. You're probably one of the few people I've had on the show that's actually gone through it. It feels like that's relevant. Can you tell us about that experience and what we can learn from it?
Well, my husband went to America through Heathrow in December and in January, and he had a very severe cough, and he's asthmatic. So it was unusual symptoms of breathlessness towards the end. And I got it in January and February. So it was a very severe cough. And I've had pneumonia before, but it was actually a dry cough. And I became breathless for a few days at the end. And then I recovered. I was fine. Of course, if I had known now, I would have supplemented myself with vitamin D, C, and zinc and rested more. But it was severe, but it turns out now we know there are preventions and treatments so that actually you wouldn't actually need to have the symptoms. And maybe it's good to say that about half or 60% or 70% of people that will come across the coronavirus will have no symptoms at all.
Okay, and now that means, in your belief, that you will not get it again.
No, so the coronaviruses are ones where the immune system gets activated and you clear the virus and you are immune for life. And how we know that is that in animal studies, you can look for the presence of the virus once the immune system works and there is no virus there in the animal models. And also some of the tests for the presence of the virus are PCR tests, and they are negative once your immune system kicks in, which takes 2 or 3 weeks.
Do you think we'll look back on this in, say, 25 years after we've done, I guess I use the word autopsy. I don't know what the equivalent is, when, maybe they can study all the genetic strains, they can go back through all the records, after all the Freedom of Information Act comes back, and we'll look at this as one of the strangest times in human history where everybody kind of duped themselves into behaving in a completely irrational way? Or do you think it'll be covered up as a real pandemic?
I think it's one of the biggest mistakes of the millennium, probably, or the biggest mistake of the century. And why I've been calling for public inquiries into it is that it's very clear how we ended up here. It's that the governments, relied on advice, 1 or 2 voices, and they were scared or intimidated by the media, and also global organizations like the World Health Organization, where there is no democratic accountability, perpetuated the fear. And that's why we have to learn lessons, because this pandemic, what I had said in the beginning is, why did it looked like Wuhan and the Lombardy region and New York were outliers of very high deaths. And what the epidemiologists should have been doing in January and February, before it even came to Europe, is to say, how come there's hardly any deaths in Japan or in South Korea or in Taiwan? What is different? And I think definitely we will find out it's either the age profile, or it might have been prior vaccination or other environmental issues. But really the death rate around the world is in the range of a normal influenza virus, and there is nothing to be afraid of. And I think we will learn a lot from why there were so many deaths in Wuhan and in Italy and in New York.
And you think it'll be a combination of those things? You said age profile, form of vaccination, and maybe toxicology in the environment.
Yeah, and I think what people should know is that 40% of the time, the influenza-like symptoms are caused by coronaviruses.
Right, I think...
You can clear those viruses, and become immune.
I think Dr. Sherry Tenpenny said that when flu is reported, it's not necessarily the flu, it's flu-like symptoms. So every year, the flu, when it's reported, has percentages of coronavirus in that. Is that correct?
So it's just that there are different families of viruses. So the influenza virus that we call flu or influenza is only 10 to 15% of the time that people have flu-like symptoms. And 40% of the time it's caused by coronaviruses. And the common cold is also caused by coronaviruses. So I think there will actually be less deaths now due to flu, because if we get our message out, people will be informed that you can actually boost your immune system by vitamins D, C, and zinc in the flu season, so that actually we can have less deaths overall for other years. And also hydroxychloroquine and zinc in the preventative dose, it has a half-life of 21 days, so that anyone who has a low immune system or is vulnerable can actually take the preventative dose of zinc and hydroxychloroquine and will actually be able to engage with these coronaviruses, and they won't make them sick at all. So we can actually reduce the burden of illness as well as death now from this experience of coronavirus. So that is good news.
No, that is good. And I'd love to get into that a little bit more detail a little bit later. So if I'm trying to understand the way you see the world is this virus breaks out in Wuhan, we start getting information, and there's a few people at the top that kind of have a vested interest in things either remaining the same or a certain narrative just staying consistent. And maybe that's people at the WHO or the CDC or someone like Fauci who's next to Trump. And they just kind of say, all right, we're going to go along with this narrative. And when a few politicians get involved, which ultimately they kind of want to protect their job, and they have to trust the scientists, they also don't want to make a major mistake. You're saying this just kind of got forced through until everyone accepted it. Then the fear came in, and then people would do anyone said. Am I far off with kind of getting the Dolores concept of what happened?
I suppose the Dolores concept, why I'm speaking up, is that what's not really highlighted enough is that if you eat well and you avoid stress and you boost your immune system, you actually won't be sick from a lot of viruses. So that's a very different narrative. So it turns out that historically, over more than 100 years, there were two schools of thought, the germ theory and the terrain theory, and they were done by Pasteur and Belchamp. And one of the theories would be, for me, the Belchamp theory would be that if you are well and not stressed, and you have good nutrients and good food, you can fight off any virus. Your immune system is working. And therefore, viruses are not something to be afraid of. But nobody really makes any money out of that, because you're talking about healthy food, no stress, and nutrition, which is really my message and a lot of the people. But unfortunately, for the last 100 years or so, the Pasteur germ theory around viruses and infection, where they have war-like analogies, and it's an outbreak, and you need to get antibiotics to defend yourself against it, as if you don't have a natural immune system. That is the kind of education and narrative that doctors have been taught in medical schools, and that the only way to recover from these viruses or infections is through antibiotics or vaccines. And so what really we have is a 100-year discussion about how is best to keep healthy. And this has really come head on with the coronavirus, because if the vaccine is the only cure, then you have to lock down the country until the vaccine comes. You don't really have any way that you yourself can prevent yourself getting sick. And then you have to shield yourself from the virus by wearing masks, and you have to social distance, and you have to keep children from playing with each other, and you have to prevent, football games and concerts. So that's a very consistent narrative if you want to say that health comes out of a vaccine and we have to lock down. And why it's difficult for people like me and others to even engage with people who have been taught that in the medical schools for maybe 2 or 3 generations is they haven't been taught about the immune system, and that we evolved with these viruses and bacteria. And if we have a healthy immune system, we don't need anything else.
Is that part of the reason? I mean, is the medical system or the medical education system, is that because a lot of that is paid for by studies funded by pharmaceutical companies? Or is it just because 100 years ago, we got into this narrative of, like you said, we're at war and you have to fortify your immune system? And I mean, what is it? What created this status quo where you get if you don't get a pill when you go to your doctor, you feel like you got a raw deal, right? If you go to your doctor like a year ago before coronavirus and you said, oh, I'm feeling sick, and they'd be like, well, go home, eat healthy, and sleep, and you'll be okay in about 10 days. You feel like, wait a second, where's my antibiotics? Where's my this? Where's my that? I mean, how did we all get into this narrative?
So you can actually trace the narrative by the Rockefeller Foundation, who set up a series of medical schools. And then they also set up the licensing of medical doctors across America and the world. And there was an awful lot of traditional healing in food, and in complex things about trying to detoxify the body and clean water and reduce stress. And so with the Rockefeller Foundation setting up medical schools and the licensing of the medical profession through those schools, they have more or less taken the Pasteur germ theory of the immune system and health, and that you can only really be healthy if you get prescribed a drug. And also now it has evolved in the last 50 years about vaccines. So they have also undermined the kind of connection between food and vitamins and nutrients in food, which is, there were like 10 Nobel Prizes in the 50s, 60s, and 70s for the discovery of vitamins, like vitamin D and C. And there was a lot of clinical trials and results to show that actually you can really recover people from even complex issues like sepsis or autoimmune disorders by giving high dose of vitamins and nutrients. And also a lot of ill health. We can even see now, if you look at the Amish population, where they don't have the same interaction with medical schools, that there's a lot of, we'll say, metabolic syndrome and autoimmune diseases and cancer and neurocognitive decline issues and Alzheimer's that they do not have. So that's almost, there's 70,000 people there. That's like a control population for people who are eating very healthily and looking after their health and their immune system, and they are in general healthy. So a lot of the issues coronavirus is bringing up, and which Dr. Judy Mikovich and Dr. Sherry Tenpenny and Dr. Buttar that you've interviewed are highlighting, is that I think we're actually on a dawn of health. Because if this message gets through, you can actually recover people from a lot of current chronic illnesses by really looking at their nutrients and their balances of vitamins, and, you know, avoid a lot of the overprescription of drugs that often have associated adverse events. And also there are issues with the vaccines that they may be made with tissues, like from dog or from monkey, you know, simian viruses that actually are known to have oncogenes that can cause specific cancers or also irritate the immune system and cause autoimmune diseases. So I think what's the media battle that's going on is actually a battle around the health of the planet, and that there are two different views, and one of them makes very little money. So I actually, in my political kind of point of view, would be thinking we actually need a new profession of health, you know, where people would pay into a system where they would not have any disease and not have any symptoms, and it might involve good nutrition and looking at their vitamin and nutrient status to be healthy.
Right, almost get a cash bonus if you're healthy, right? Because you're not drawing down from that system. And from what I understand, like, you know, all medical schools, I mean, to rise up in those ranks in medicine, you need to publish, and studies have to be funded by ultimately mostly pharmaceutical companies. So it's kind of maybe not always quid pro quo, but the whole profession, it's almost baked in to this almost benefactor, which are these people that provide these studies. And so whether it's intentional or not, everyone is around this industry of pharmacy and writing prescriptions and supporting these massive companies that end up paying for these doctors' entire careers. I mean, that is what it looks like, right?
Well, there is also, to be fair, you know, government funding agencies, you know, and where the governments like then the European Union actually fund a lot of these studies. But a lot of the time there are consensus, even in those committees, that say if you take a different, more holistic view on health, like I know there was studies done with the National Institute of Health funding, and only 3% of their funding went to health, and 97% of their funding went to disease. So you do have pharmaceutical companies that fund clinical trials, but also you do have government funding agencies and international agencies. But a lot of the time they take their guidance by people who are high up in a profession that might have a worldview that doesn't really encompass health and no symptoms and elimination of disease. A lot of the time chronic diseases are treated, but they're not really eliminated, you know?
Understood. All right, well, I definitely want to get into vaccines and also talking about some of the vitamins, but I also just want to finish up with your censorship. Why were you censored? Were you surprised that a video was taken down of you actually speaking on like a network? I think it was YouTube. Why did that happen? Did you expect that was going to happen? And do you worry now when you put stuff out there?
Well, I mean, I have always been a free speech advocate, but it was I think my first science interview. You know, I had given some small talks about encouraging freedom of speech with the Irish Freedom Party. But I think why I came out was that the Irish Medicines Organization, about 3 days before, on the 5th of May, had come out and said they wanted to mandatorily vaccinate the total population of Ireland with this influenza vaccine. And sometimes, you know, in this crisis pandemic situation, I was afraid that the government would come out with that kind of a policy very quickly, and it would be very difficult to roll back. So all I wanted to do was, which I just highlighted, about 10 slides that gave, first of all, the slide from the CDC to show that the level of the coronavirus had a sharp decline on the 17th of April. This was published by the director of the CDC. So essentially I was saying this is behaving like a normal flu virus. It's gone. We really don't need to take all these measures. But the other slides then were around a series of animal studies and a study from the US military, where they showed that if you have coronavirus in an influenza vaccine or a coronavirus itself, that there were serious consequences for the animals in those studies. So in one study, all of the animals got sick and some of them died. And in the US Army study by Dr. Wolf, he said that 36% of the American soldiers given the influenza vaccine that had corona in 2017, 2018, that 36% of them had adverse effects. And so that if they were going to vaccinate the total population of Ireland with this influenza vaccine containing dog material that had corona, you could be dealing with a huge epidemic of illness. The next time a coronavirus came along, or what I was afraid is if they vaccinated with influenza in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, when people were locked in their houses, that when they would come out in the next week or two, or whenever the lockdown is ended globally, that you could have huge deaths and huge people just collapsing because they would get this immune over-response and cytokine storm, and that the ill effects could be thousands of people. And people might say they weren't aware that this was predictable. So very few people in the world would actually make the connection between the vaccine for influenza and people collapsing with the coronavirus. So I just, not very dramatically, just wanted to go through the studies. And I mentioned the Irish Medicines Organization, that I thought this was very unwise. And it was really about 50 minutes of an interview with Dave Cullen on Computing Forever. And it was my first science one. And within 6 days, it got over 450,000 views on YouTube. And then it was taken down, which of course is huge reputational damage for me, because you would think if you were banned from YouTube that you were saying something very wrong. But all I was doing was presenting results from the director of the CDC that anyone could access on the CDC website, and just a number of publications, including one from Nature Medicine.
Why do you think these are so popular, these ideas? Because, like you said, 450,000 views, Dr. Buttar, 6 million views, 9 billion views, our videos, tens and tens of millions of views. There's clearly a demand for this information out there. And yet at the same time, these technology platforms decide it's not okay to have this information public. What do you make of both of those things?
Well, I suppose what I've been calling for is a public inquiry. I did another interview with Del Bigtree on the High Wire, that actually that individual people have to be held to account for censoring or not making available information that could keep people healthy and prevent deaths. So what I said in that video is, I'm not saying I'm right. I could be wrong, and I would suffer rightly professional and reputational damage if I'm wrong. But if I'm right, and there's only very few immunologists who would be aware of the complexity of this issue, and that if genuinely the politicians weren't made aware of it, or the doctors or the Irish Medicines Organization or the families of people who could potentially die, then actually, if I'm right, censoring that information may result in deaths that are preventable. And so what I'm saying is the people who censor then have to actually, in a public inquiry format, have to be held accountable, because that's actually malfeasance. Or, in the medical profession, it's associated, with misconduct. And for politicians and civil servants, it's malfeasance in public office or misconduct in public office. Because what they're doing by censoring the discussion and by, we'll say, the BBC or RTE or Channel 4 or News Talk in Ireland, not having people like me on to be debated and to be proved wrong, is that it could be that there are many, many deaths because of censoring the information. And I've been aware of this kind of issue for the last 2 years, or well, many years. But that's why I decided that scientists need to actually stand for election and to open the debate about academic freedom and freedom of speech in society, because there will be unnecessary illnesses and incorrect policies if people like me don't speak out.
Has your reputation been hurt since the video was banned?
Well, I've been politely asked to remove myself from one of the EU advisory boards. You know, it was a voluntary thing, but they've asked me to step down. But to be fair, my employer have so far been very kind and have, you know, not mentioned it so far. But in a way, I felt, and I do feel, that we have a moral and ethical responsibility, that it doesn't really matter what happens to me, because if I'm wrong, which I could be wrong, I will have to bear the consequences of reputational damage and professional damage. But if I'm right, and the medical organizations go ahead with compulsory or mandatory vaccinations, or encouraging people to take an influenza vaccine that potentially has this issue of dog tissue with dog coronaviruses that can cause cytokine storms for huge numbers of the population, then that could be thousands of deaths, and I couldn't really live with that. It wouldn't be right.
Yeah, this is such a serious issue, you know, and you mentioned being politely asked to leave, like, you know, certain associations. So I've been politely and impolitely asked to leave a lot of things recently. And it's been eye-opening, Dolores, to see it happen, you know, whether being completely deplatformed and deleted from LinkedIn, to have our content and our account removed from Dropbox, which meant they were watching our videos on Dropbox, Vimeo, not to mention YouTube deleting and banning our massive live stream with David Icke, the second largest YouTube live stream in the world on April 6th, a video that would have...
I watched it live.
You did? Oh, fantastic. I mean, a video that would have gone on to be watched 30 million times easily if it had stayed on that YouTube channel. Again, deleted. And I've had intimate conversations with YouTube representatives who are censoring me. Now, what they said about that conversation 24 hours later, when I finally got on the phone after they spoke to the BBC and told them what they did, even though I was a partner there for 8 years and, you know, had also made them a lot of advertising money, they didn't even call me. But I did finally have a conversation. They said, "Oh, he's a COVID-19 denier," is what he said at the time. And I said, that's not true, actually. If you listen to everything he said, what you're doing is taking a soundbite and a clickbait headline and sticking it on what he said. Actually, what he said was this: the test brings up all sorts of random pieces of RNA. Some of that can false positively test for this. And I went to the whole explanation, and they were like, "No, COVID-19 denier. And also, you mentioned 5G, which meant it's gone." Now, Dolores, we hadn't even mentioned the V word at that point. Now, when the vaccines came up, they saw my interview with Robert Kennedy, I think on this platform, and basically said to me, "Don't even think about putting that on YouTube." Because when the V word comes up, it almost takes what I thought was, you know, a fascist level of censorship. The V word, it feels like it's 5X that, you know, and that even opened my eyes even more to the censorship. But you're right. I mean, it's dangerous what they're doing. And it's a few people in Silicon Valley saying, "No, you can't do this, and no, you can't do that." And these are our community standards, which I was told on the phone on Friday, "Oh, they change all the time, and we don't even know what's in there, but you can't violate them or we're going to pull your channel down." So, I mean, that's a little bit what I'm dealing with in the background. And by the way, the last thing they said to me on Friday was, "You are one video away from being completely deleted and deplatformed off of YouTube." That's almost 8,000 videos, 9 years of content, 250 million views that has literally changed the lives of millions of people. By the way, a lot of times showing them how to eat better, move their bodies better, be more spiritual, be more loving, be more caring. You know, that's our content. And yet we've still struggled with that a little bit. So that's what I'm dealing with here, Dolores. I don't know if we still have your video feed coming here. Let me just check my people here. Dolores, we might just check in there and check on your video. I know you've had a couple episodes in the past where we lost your stream. So we'll just send you a message here. But just for me to continue that thought, that's where we're at. And so I never understood the level of censorship that was out there regarding vaccines. And you've been on the front lines with this, but it's something that's very serious. And I'm starting to understand all of the strange forces involved, whether it comes to the status quo, to the medical community, to the pharmaceutical business, to all these other strange industries that somehow seem involved, including technology. And that's what's almost baffling to me, that a $1 trillion search engine technology company might care about you speaking the truth about a vaccine. And so that's what boggles my mind. But I'm literally in the middle of that fight right now, and I know you are too. And I know you've already felt it. So I'm sorry I'm late.
I was aware of it. Yeah. So one of the reasons why I decided to enter politics was that when my daughter was 11 or 12, she got the the vaccine from the schools, but without the patient information leaflet. And of course, there is a societal trust between the medical profession and doctors that you can only make a medical decision if you have full informed consent. And so with the information, there wasn't the patient information leaflet with the vaccine. And I immediately went to the next morning to the people who were given the vaccine saying, where is the patient information leaflet? This is wrong. And then when I looked into it, that there were issues around Irish law and EU law that now no longer, because we were members of the European Union, that we were not given full informed consent. And that's why I decided it's time for me to actually dedicate, 10 years of my life to ensure that people have informed consent. And the reason why they want to silence the discussion is that people do not have the information that vaccines are not safety tested and that they contain ingredients that in and of themselves are really toxic. So like 70% of the vaccines have aluminium, and aluminium is a neurotoxin, and I would never take aluminium. It should not be injected. It shouldn't be in the vaccine. And for decades, mercury, which is one of the most toxic substances on earth, was in vaccines given to babies. And babies before 9 months or a year cannot make antibodies. So they're given vaccines they were aluminium and mercury. So why they don't want this discussion is that they want to say the current lockdown is going to be solved by a vaccine, but they don't want people raising questions about that the vaccines are not safety tested and that they actually might be the source of a lot of illnesses and symptoms like chronic fatigue. And that's why they are censoring and undermining reputationally people who are raising issues about the vaccine, or that you can actually boost your immune system and be healthy without vaccines, because then that would undermine their business model.
Now, who's they? Because is that the governments? Is that Google? Is that pharmaceutical companies? Or are they working in concert? I find it hard to believe that anybody can work in concert. So who is they, do you think?
That is a very good question. So I suppose, what we have to say is there are people of goodwill in the world, and that individual doctors and nurses and people who work in government agencies and funding agencies and medical organizations probably went into that profession or into science or into media not wanting to do wrong things. But when you look behind a lot of the things that's going on, those people were not educated, or it's very difficult for them to get the information. And that's why the patient information leaflet that I decided was for me a kind of a line in the sand, that people have to know what's in these vaccines or medical interventions that they're getting. Because by law on the patient information leaflet, it will have a list of what the adverse events are, which are like chronic fatigue or multiple sclerosis or juvenile arthritis. There's a list of multiple diseases. And the reasons why people themselves and parents need to know is that if they don't know, and then it usually takes months for a child to go from being healthy, we'll say, to get multiple sclerosis. If the parent doesn't have the information, they won't make the connection. So they won't be able to get the right treatment for their child. And a lot of people feel let down because it takes them years before they make the connection. And then they realize, if I had the patient information leaflet, I wouldn't have made that decision, or I could have helped my child better. So that's about informed consent and access to information. So what's going on now is that it's almost like this lockdown is entirely unnecessary, but the solution of it is to vaccinate. And so I don't exactly know the answer who they are, but they're compounding a solution to a problem. The problem itself is not necessary. It was responded to incorrectly. And the so-called solution to this problem may cause a huge amount of ill health. And there are politicians and the pharmaceutical industry, there are scientists and doctors and civil servants and journalists, that all of whom are good people, but they don't actually know that there's a serious issue going on. They're not aware of it. They themselves don't have the information. And they're now making it difficult for people like us to join the dots. And they are othering us, by calling us deniers and putting, words into our mouths that we haven't said, and trying to undermine our reputations very successfully and intimidate us by not being able to earn a living. And that is as well so that other people who might themselves raise questions couldn't afford to be in a situation where they might lose their income and their professional standing and their standing in society. So it's a process of intimidation and lack of information. And I would say the people that really should know, and that's why we're talking about malfeasance, which is a crime, is that the ministers for health and the people in the head of these medical organizations. So malfeasance is, even if you don't know, or you say you don't know, you should have known. And so why we're being censored is that if we get millions of views, then they cannot turn around and say, I wasn't aware of the issue, of the immune issue and adverse events associated with an influenza vaccine. Because if it came to an inquiry or to a legal claim, people would say, well, Dolores Cahil or people that you found have got 30 million views. You should have been aware. So it's in their interest to censor the information so that if there is an inquiry, that they can say, well, we weren't aware of those issues. So that's what's going on.
Yeah, there's so many things you just said there that are powerful. I mean, first of all, that use of making you the others, or people that, anti-vaxxers are the others, and to see the reaction of mainstream media the way it's almost as if you're lepers, and maybe I'm in this camp now too. Maybe I joined your team, but New York Times wrote an article about Judy Mikovits like a couple days after she was on our show, and I mean, it's almost like before they can finish the sentence, they're saying these crazies. Like everyone knows they're crazy. It's just strange how they put those people in this weird box, or at least they used to. It seems like that's changing a lot. So that's one thing they do. Again, like you said, there's lots of interest. I never thought about that lack of liability interest. And I'm wondering, Dolores, if the next time I'm on the phone with YouTube, assuming I am, if I should tell them that, by the way, Dolores told me that you might be in front of a criminal tribunal if you continue to censor me. So I might ask them that. The next thing I want to talk about.
And maybe I should just add that I have said in a number of interviews that, there are different areas where people can personally be held to account. And I've been contacted by over 40 countries, and I'm aware of more than in different all continents in the world, and 7 different legal inquiries where they are taking either the president of the country under either their local law, like in Spain, or under common law. And why I think it's important for the YouTube, the people who are censoring, and also the civil servants and the people who are running the health system, as well as the elected officials, that under common law and under criminal law of malfeasance or negligence or misconduct, that they can be individually liable, even if they are a middle-ranking manager. Because, for example, the FDA came out and prevented the use of hydroxychloroquine zinc as a treatment, or if YouTube are censoring preventions and treatments, that in individual countries, those CEOs, by preventing health information getting out, are contributing to unnecessary deaths. And I think it's important that we say it now in the middle of the censorship, and your platform is very valuable, because they need to know that they will be held to account.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.